So today we have Kevyn Collins-Thompson, who spent most of the 90s as an early employee at Microsoft before leaving to do various things like learn to play piano and get a PhD, which is where I met him about 10 years ago at Carnegie Mellon. So I'd best describe Kevyn, I think, as one of the least boring researchers in information retrieval from the point of view of a computational linguist. So Kevyn is interested in really a lot of relatively rich bits of signal than maybe a normal IR person would consider, which means that he has a lot of interesting things to talk to us about, and it also means that he has to do a lot of very hard math, which means that he has other interesting things to talk to different subsets of us. I'm really glad that he could come, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Ben. I think that was the best compliment I've ever gotten. Thank you very much. And thanks to Ben for inviting me and hosting my visit. I'm really pleased to be here. I feel like coming from the LTI at CMU, being among language technologies folks, I feel very comfortable and excited by all the cool stuff I'm hearing about. So today I'm going to talk to you about an area that kind of brings together two of my interests. I consider myself a core information retrieval person, but for about 10 years I've also been fascinated with educational applications of information retrieval, including the ability to assess the difficulty of text, different kinds of text for different kinds of readers and so on. And so I'm going to talk about, now that I'm at Microsoft Research, looking at, from the perspective of reading level, what happens when you suddenly have access to billions of web pages that are annotated with interesting reading level metadata. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators on this work that represents the results from several different papers: Paul Bennett, Ryan White, and Susan Dumais from MSR, Jin Young Kim, a very talented intern from UMass, Sebastian Delachica and Yun Sharma from Microsoft, and David Sontag from NYU. So the basic premise of some of this work is that there's been a huge effort, obviously, to maximize relevance for search engines, using different metrics. But a lot of that work, until recently, has really sort of ignored the issue of text difficulty, which is surprising considering that, in general, even if you get back lots of great results, if you can't understand some of the results, they're really not as relevant. I say they're not relevant, of course. As a grad student, I remember reading papers that I had no comprehension of whatsoever. And so I put in this little caveat: they're not immediately relevant. If you can't understand them, they can still be valuable to your future self. But I'm more interested, for this purpose of this talk, in finding information that's more immediately relevant. And most of what I'll talk about in the middle of the talk is about personalization. The idea that by building models of difficulty for content and building models of interest, intent, and expertise of users, really getting at a better matching function that brings material at the right reading level, a level that the user wants for that query. And I want to emphasize that a lot of the time when I talk about reading level in search, people assume that I'm talking about search for children, which is a very interesting, fascinating area by itself. But I'm also interested in areas, the type of tasks where an expert might actually be looking for expert material and not interested in more introductory material, or where users are maybe, everybody is an expert in different areas, and so trying to get at joint modeling of topic and reading level. So you might find information that you're less of an expert on in one topic and want to learn more about. So that's the general premise of this a significant part of the work. But as I'll show later, as I began working in this area, applying reading level models to web data, I started discovering all sorts of other uses beyond just personalization that web metadata based on reading level could really bring. And I'll talk about what I consider a few of those really interesting applications also. So just a brief structure of this talk. I'll give a little bit of an introduction to what I mean by predicting reading level of web pages. This is going to be work based on some early work I did with Jamie Callan that was published at HLT in 2004 using simple language modeling. I'll sort of just summarize a more advanced model that by Paul Kidwell, Guy Lebanon, and myself that was published at EMNLP in 2009. This talk primarily is not about how to do reading level prediction per se. There's been a lot of great work recently on using different features to predict difficulty. A lot of what I'm talking about, in some sense, doesn't depend so much on the nature of the prediction mechanism. But I will go over some ideas so you get a sense for what happens when I talk about reading level prediction for web pages. So the types of IR applications that I'll focus on here are primarily personalization, although not exclusively, and then some additional findings. So talking about how we can determine issues with the snippet quality. So a snippet is the little blurb of 10 or 20 words, 30 words that you see that summarizes a particular search result. I'll talk about how reading level and topic metadata together can really help characterize user expertise. When you model them jointly, you get much better effects. You could also, of course, characterize site expertise with similar representations. And finally, I'll just discuss what I consider another really fascinating finding, which is just getting at, once we have reading level information about sites, about pages, and about users on a large scale, we can start to discern some sort of very weak proxies of cognitive load for what people are trying to do, their certain tasks. I'll get into that later as well. So I don't think it's any surprise that web pages occur at a wide range of reading difficulty levels. So I picked out a particular query here, insect diet. So this is an example of a page that's sort of lower difficulty. It has an accompanying picture. The language is fairly straightforward. Another example of a slightly harder page would be something teaching about the anatomy. So there are certain specialized words. Again, there's a supporting picture. Getting into more sophisticated vocabulary and syntax. And then there are sort of research level pages that describe academic research into insect diets. And just as web pages can exhibit many different kinds of difficulty-related features, you can have many users. So users, you have students at different grade levels. You have non-native speakers from different parts of the world. Even within the general population, sort of different levels of overall language proficiency and fluency. Familiarity or expertise in particular topic areas. So I never thought, for example, that sports was an area that you could have extremely high reading difficulty, but I was wrong. There are these scouting sites that use very specialized vocabulary to describe scouting reports. Of course, every domain has that kind of interesting specialized vocabulary that's interesting to model. Even within a single user, there can be very broad variation in intent across queries and sessions and tasks. So I might look for material for myself, but also be helping my daughter with homework, looking for material. So that even within sort of a narrow range of users and time, there can be quite a broad variation of interests. So if we take a look at the default results for insect diet, this is a little bit outdated, but actually if you run the same query again, the results are substantially similar. So at the top of the list, so we imagine that we're maybe a middle school student looking for grasshopper or other types of information about insect diets. A lot of the material on the page is highly technical. Some of it's not relevant for other reasons. It's a commercial query, for example. There are a few pages here that might be considered more appropriate for that particular grade level. And so one thing you could imagine doing is blending in results, looking deeper down in the ranking, identifying those pages that are maybe a better match for this person and their goal, and then maybe interleaving them in some way or re-ranking so that there are at least some more results, more substantial results on the page to make them happier. Now, reading difficulty is a fascinating phenomenon that people have studied for arguably thousands of years, but especially in the last 100 years. Clearly, there are factors that involve semantics, especially vocabulary, and that's the one I'll be focusing on today, but that doesn't mean it's the only important one. Of course, there are also syntactic issues, sentence structure, and complexity. There's been a lot of work recently that explores some of these higher-level features, like discourse-level structure, to predict reading difficulty at a higher level. What's the cohesion of this this paragraph, this essay? What are the cogent arguments of the essay? What's the background and interest in the topic for a person? So that can have a huge effect on how interesting you find something and how accessible you perceive it to be, as if you're interested in it or not. Is the text in a readable font? It may sound obvious, but there are issues of legibility. There's sort of an interesting sub-area, color, size, and so forth. And finally, are there supporting illustrations? So there's been some fascinating work by some folks at Mountain View, MSR Mountain View, on finding supporting material for parts of textbooks that are more difficult. That's another interesting area of research that sort of tries to use the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that there are more than just text can help with reduce the difficulty or increase comprehension for texts. So the things I'll be talking about are different from parental control, filtering. Those are very important, but I'm not going to get into sort of spam filtering, that sort of thing. I'm also not going to talk about all the many interesting UI issues that come up, especially with regard to kids search. There's a great project called the Puppy IR project that was funded in the EU that did some really innovative work recently on specializing search engines for children that I encourage you to check out if you're interested. Another thing people ask me when I mention I'm working in this area is they say, well, I see this thing in Word. They shipped it, so it must be done. So what, just use this formula. Everybody knows about this formula. It's the Flesch-Kincaid formula. It's been around since the 40s, and it's worked. People have used it for a lot of sort of traditional texts. It's still used as, say, a leveling component in some of the graded passage work that's created. But basically, all it does is it counts up the sentences, counts up the words in the sentences, divides words into syllables. Actually, the amazing thing is there was actually a special typewriter that was developed when I forget whether it was Flesch or Kincaid, but the typewriter that would sort of allow you to sort of programmatically, in a human sense, insert syllable markers. It would sort of have a little counter that would actually compute the readability as you were typing the text, which is kind of cool. But anyway, so this is the formula that's used in Word. And so one question is, why not just plug things into this? Well, there are numerous problems with this formula when you want to apply it to the web. So some of them are pretty obvious, like assumes that the content has well-formed sentences to begin with. It's very sensitive to noise. Typically, you have to have at least 100 words for this formula to even approach being reliable. That's true for most readability prediction formulas. So what I'm interested in is things that work on web documents, things that work on things that are 5 words. So I want a readability assessment for a 5-word snippet. I want to have something that works on very short passages as well as very long things. And so on the web, obviously, you find pages, titles, snippets, queries, captions. All of these sort of non-traditional documents require readability assessment, but they don't work with these traditional formulas at all. The other issue that we'll get into briefly is that I want to apply these methods on billions of pages, and that itself limits the nature of the approaches that are feasible, at least today. So I'll be talking about reading level methods that apply, they're primarily vocabulary based, because that's where most of the signal typically is in difficulty, although they're very interesting other sort of types of signals. But because of the scale of the problem, I'll be focusing on simpler models that exploit vocabulary only. Typically, we'll train these models. We have labeled texts that were labeled either implicitly or explicitly by experts using on a grade level scale. And so just to give you some intuition about how some of these models work, if I have a corpus of documents that's been divided into bins, I put each document into one of, say, 12 bins based on, say, American grade levels 1 to 12. And then I estimate just a simple probability, I'd look at the vocabulary across the documents, and I estimate the likelihood as the bin changes, what's the likelihood of the relative change in the probability of this word. So what you see are trends like the following. You see some words have a pretty well-defined peak at a certain grade range. So a word like perimeter peaks around grade 5 or 6, where it's typically introduced and used more in the curriculum. You see a concrete word, and this is true for many colors, and this is a well-known, this was a well-known fact before, that concrete words tend to occur more frequently in easier texts. So a word like red will be used a lot in earlier grades and then diminish. More abstract words, more advanced vocabulary like determine will increase in probability with grade level. And then you'll have some sort of very weakly discriminative terms like the, which may have a small amount of discriminative power, but I tend to be more or less flat and not as content rich, as it were.
Is this data available for higher grades, or does it end up only at 12? Because I assume that it's going down because the new words are being introduced, right? But does it ever flatten?
So actually, I'm right in the middle of creating an academic corpus. So that's an excellent observation. So if anybody is aware of an academic corpus, it'd be great to hear about it. I'm in the middle of creating one myself, for the reason you mentioned, that's a very interesting distinction that needs to be made. Okay, so with these kinds of trends, this is just a very simple model, sort of a mixture model. With these trends, then you can do some very simple types of prediction. You simply, so here's an example of the red ball. You can look up, essentially what happens is each word gets a vote for a particular grade. So there's really nothing sophisticated here. It's basically slightly like naive Bayes, except there's also this very important mixture component across the levels because the levels are related. But the interesting thing is, even these simple models actually produce some reasonable predictions. So if you plug in these probabilities, you get these probabilities from the corpus, and then you compute a likelihood. What's the likelihood that this phrase was generated from each of the grade levels? So here the example turns out it predicts grade 1. If you change it from the red ball to the red perimeter, it predicts grade 5. And if you change it to the perimeter was optimized, it predicts grade 12. And so it turns out that if you, for many standard web pages, a lot of pages have a pretty well-defined maximum likelihood under this type of model. And again, this is not quite like naive Bayes. In the HLT paper of 2004, we described why it's important to smooth across models, grade models. But in general, this simple approach works pretty well. And so we can do some fun things like extract the most discriminative features for each grade. And so for grade 1, we find that words like grown up and pig are Jimmy are very discriminative for grade 1. As you increase the grade level, the grade 4 and grade 8, you'll see the interesting thing is that you see words that they're short. They're not necessarily difficult to read sort of on a surface level, but they encode more advanced scientific concepts, like the fact that what an acid is, for example. And then by grade 12, you see there are a lot of terms that are more literary, more abstract, that become prominent. So that's one very, very simple model. Yes?
So in addition to being able to predict the reading level for the whole page, you probably also look at reading levels for windows.
That's right. Yes.
I'm curious how much, as you slide a window across the page, how much the reading level changes, either because it really does or because the mechanism provides.
I have an example for you in about two slides. But that's a very good point. So actually, in predicting the reading level of a document, the actual technique that I found is more effective for this model is to use a sliding window. To accumulate a profile of a document. You can do a simple estimate, but a sliding window where you accumulate distribution is more effective. So, yeah.
And a quick question: the little example you gave about the red ball, red perimeter, especially for the highest grade, I remember the sentence was longer, so or the phrase was longer. So you factored out length effects, I suppose, when you do these model likelihoods.
Yeah, there is a length there's a length normalization factor that we apply. Any other questions? Okay, so that was one of the first models that actually use language modeling for reading level prediction. In a subsequent work with Paul Kidwell and Guy Lebanon, it was published at EMNLP and recently in the Journal of the American Statistical Association, we tried to make a sort of a richer model of difficulty, and the key idea here was to define readability in terms of two parameters. The first parameter, which we called R, was a parameter that set the familiarity threshold. Should be a familiar word, but it's not. A word is familiar at a grade if it's known by at least R% of the population in that grade. And this actually has its foundation in some older reading level measurements. There's a measurement called the Dale-Chall reading list, where essentially they had a single list for grade 4 students. So back in the 40s, they came up with a list of, I think it was 200 words. And a word was considered familiar if 80% of the 4th grade students knew the meaning of that word. So this is kind of like an extension of that idea to multiple grade levels. The second parameter is a coverage requirement for documents. So a document is readable at level T if S% of the words in the document are familiar at that grade level. And so what we did was we modeled every word. So the goal of this paper was to sort of try to estimate when people first acquired usage of the word. So we modeled each word with a Gaussian. And we came up with a simple, actually it wasn't that simple, maximum likelihood model that we just trained using gradient descent from a set of labeled documents. And I can go into the gory details later if anybody's interested, but the point is that we learned these Gaussian parameters per word together, and also we learned the R and S parameters. So the idea here is that if you have a familiarity Gaussian for the word red, then at the 80th percentile of that distribution, that's grade level 3.5. Perimeter would be, say, 8.2. And then once you have these familiarity Gaussians, then you can look at the document and you can say, okay, I've got to distribute the probability mass of this document from 0 to 1 as we go through all the words. And the question is, at which points does it rise in this cumulative distribution? So then we can say, at a coverage of 70%, this particular document, if you sort of just look at this cumulative density function, you can sort of just follow it down and say, okay, the grade level of this is 8.8. And so with a multi-word example, you can imagine having lots of these Gaussians. You formulate the CDF, and again, to predict the grade level at a given coverage level S, you would just, again, sort of look on the CDF to where it gets 70% coverage. And that turns out to be the grade level. So the statistical model is quite complex. I'm happy to discuss details later. So now that we have predictions for web pages based on these kinds of statistical models, what can we do with them? Well, obviously we can get not only an average level for a page, but we can get a distribution over levels, which is very important in extracting confidence information, say, for search engines or other things. So we can look at the expectation of the distribution. We can look at its entropy. We can do a sliding window, look through time or position the document. We can identify key technical terms, regions that need augmentation, sort of specialist terms that might be important to understand a document. And then once we have metadata for a document, then we can aggregate documents across sites, and we can look at the aggregated reading difficulty profile of all the documents that people visit on a site, or all the documents that exist on the site, which are two very different subsets sometimes. We can do the same thing for users. We can look at the sites and pages people visit. We can look at what people click, what they don't click, aggregate those statistics over a short time or a long time, and look at building up a user profile in that way. So here's an example of a sliding window. So what I did was I took the movie dialogue. Actually, this is a fairly long document because it's the entire script of the movie The Matrix Reloaded. You might have seen that movie, but so this is a sliding window that goes through the entire movie script, And at the bottom it shows it a percentile amount through the text, and this y-axis shows grade level. This is kind of a fun example of the ability to pick up on interesting places in a sort of time series. So the first funny thing is that
Percentile here, you mean
Sorry.
that's dividing the movie up by time, and each one is a 5-second snapshot?
yeah, percentile is probably not the right. It's the percentage of the script that we went through, basically.
And you've got a fixed size at every point, right?
The window is a fixed size, right? It was 100 words, I think. And so one thing we noticed right away is that whenever Keanu Reeves enters the scene, the reading level plummets to its lowest possible level. But you can also pick out other interesting things, like there's a scene, I don't know if people remember the movie, but there's a scene where this guy who speaks mostly in French, a mixture of French and English. And so when he enters that scene, you get this big spike in English difficulty. And then there's that big scene at the end with the architect where he gives this long explanation of the what's going on. So that's easily identifiable as well just by looking at this window profile. So that's just one example of some sort of interesting time series analysis you can do. Okay, so now we've got these sort of metadata. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to personalize using reading level for a real web search application. We've done some preliminary analysis just to look at, just for example, what percentage of queries might be related to children's information needs. So one thing we did to categorize the type of query, so what is a kid's query or a science query, we will take the top 10 or 20 results that the search engine provides. We have Open Directory, we've labeled each of those results not just with reading level but with ODP, Open Directory topics. So there are 220, 15 or so high-level topics, and then the rest are sort of second-level topics. So we can look at those and we can say, a query that returns predominantly science categorized results can be, for broad purposes, interpreted as a science query. We did the same for kids queries because there's a special category for kids and teens in the ODP that's been specifically curated for that population. So, and we found about 13% of queries could be considered as sort of kids-oriented. So that's one example of a population that may have the potential. So that may be overstating. It's sort of closer to maybe an upper bound than what is applicable for that population. But it's an interesting statistic. I mean, this is over 286 million queries that we were able to do some of this analysis. Okay, so the goal for personalization here is we make use of what we call session data, which is a short-term type of history. A session we regard as anything, I think it's a series of queries that are all sort of contiguous in time without too many gaps, I think a 30-minute gap. I'm skipping over lots of interesting problems like how to identify a mixture of tasks in the same session and that sort of thing. We'll focus just on a simple model of sessions. We also have the potential for longer-term cross-session, which is also very interesting, but I'm not going to get into that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to extract features about users, features about content, features about the interaction of users and content, feed them into a re-ranker, and then take an existing set of search results, say the top 20 search results, and adjust the ranking. Now this is a very risky thing to do because the production ranker in a commercial search engine is very highly tuned. I mean, it's one of those things that you want to be very conservative about changing. And so one of the challenges here is to do personalization in a way that is both effective but also has a reduced sort of downside risk. Okay, so there are different ways you get somebody's search intent. You could ask them. You could say, what are your preferences for this query? You could also learn somebody's interests and expertise over time. The types of features, as I said, we extract are things from queries. What's the length of the query in characters? What's the vocabulary of the query? And so on. And so the type of session data we look at, our models, again, for sessions are very, very simple. Nothing sophisticated. So we start off with some prior distribution over difficulty levels. We look at what they click on. And with each click, we update our estimates for this particular session which was sort of a proxy for the task. What is the difficulty of the pages they liked? So when I say liked, what I mean is something people click on and then stayed on for like 30 seconds. So I think 30 seconds is what we call the satisfied click threshold. And so we use that as kind of an implicit measure of relevance. So if somebody does that, we sort of assume that's one implicit measure of interest. So as they issue another query in the session, we get an updated view of their profile in reading level interests, as it were. And then with that, we can extract things like what is the expectation, what are the entropy, and so forth.
Yeah, quick comment.
Yes.
This 30 seconds seems like an awfully long time. Are you guys shortchanging yourself? I'm thinking that if it's not the right page, it's not what I'm looking for. It takes me maybe 3 seconds to know that. With 5.
It's a pretty conservative estimate for liking.
You might be getting what they like in 15 seconds, and you might still say they didn't stay long.
That's true. Yeah, it's a conservative estimate for what people like. And the other thing that's sort of conflated is, if the page is difficult, it might take them longer than 30 seconds to figure out this thing isn't really talking about what I need. So again, I'm sort of oversimplifying in some respects, but you're right. It's I have a slide in about 2 slides. I'll summarize that for you. Yes, I have. Okay, so the ranking algorithm here isn't really of great importance. We use, we just get a bunch of features. We get labels. We put a heavy bias on the production rankers score or ranking because we don't want to mess with that. We use something called LambdaMart, which was developed at Microsoft. It won the Yahoo Learn to Rank Challenge. Basically, it's based on boosted decision trees. But other algorithms you could use for a variety of reasons as well. I won't go into the details of the evaluation too much, except to say it's really hard to evaluate personalization compared to, say, standard retrieval, because a document that may be relevant in one context may not be relevant in a different context. So to get an accurate assessment, you would need to show a judge not only the document, but also the context, the queries, and the session, for example, that the document occurred in. And so that's why we rely on this satisfied click measure as kind of an implicit measure of relevance that does implicitly take into account context. It's not a perfect measurement, but it's a reasonable one, I think. And so we're trying to look at queries where there was a satisfied click, and we're trying to get that satisfied click up higher in the ranking. So we use a mean reciprocal rank of the last satisfied click, and also mean average precision. But MRR is the main one we look at. So we do some things that are important. We subsample to one random query per session. We don't want to bias towards longer sessions. We don't want to make sure that we don't have the same queries in the training and test set when we use cross-validation and so on. For this particular paper, this is CICAM 2011 paper, we had about 750,000 queries, and about 200,000 of those had at least one previous query. Now, I can't show you the absolute performance of the production baseline, but I can show you the relative improvements in, this is change in mean reciprocal rank and change in mean average precision, they're very similar because there aren't that many queries that have multiple satisfied clicks. So I want to emphasize that a lot of the time we send in something like this and the response is, that looks like a pretty small gain. Are you really getting something that's interesting? And beating the rank-only production baseline is really hard. Adding new features and trying to improve the ranking is really hard. And it's becoming harder over time to find these kinds of gains. So any gain of greater than, more than 1.0 of MRR point gain is significant. So I guess the bottom line is that overall, about 1.6% of all queries, and that's important to note because the vast majority of search engine queries are navigational queries, which are not necessarily amenable to personalization, at least not this kind. So the fact that there's, again, a 1.6% coverage for all queries may sound quite small, but actually it's highly significant given the volume of traffic. So 6% of all queries were improved at least one rank position in satisfied click. And for the large rank changes, there was more than a 70% chance that a large rank change where we promoted a result was likely to result in a win. So we were pretty encouraged by these results, considering that we weren't really targeting general relevance in the first place.
Can you measure that more than 5, it doesn't have to be in the top 20 or something, and more than, meaning change in 5, bringing it within the first page, or just change in 5? I mean, what is the size of the re-ranking list?
In this case, it was 10 results.
Okay, so just the first page that the user
Just the first page the user
something
sees.
either moved into it from 5 positions below or within that can it move by 5. That's 70% of the time is a win.
Yeah.
Okay, good. No, that's good to know because I have no clue.
Okay, so which features were most important in getting this gain? So session-based context, a good snippet page match, which I'll go into more in a minute. The really interesting finding here is that people look at the snippet to judge relevance a lot of the time. You know, that's their key judgment. But sometimes the reading level of the snippet doesn't match the underlying page, and that can be a problem, as I'll show you in a minute. People tended to prefer results, all things being equal. They tend to click on the easiest snippet. So if things were generally all relevant, there was a consistent pattern of clicking on the snippet that appeared to be the easiest one. So that was an informative feature. And then simple things like query length and characters. And using all features here perform best. So this is just you can see that the baseline search engine ranking is the reciprocal rank feature at the very top. So we don't really mess with the production ranking. We put a very high weight on production ranking, but relative snippet difficulty, people are clicking on the easiest thing, longer queries, session level features, differences between page and snippet, those are all useful and contributed to the gains that we saw. So we also segmented queries by the ODP method that I told you about earlier, where we looked at kids queries, science queries, sports queries, health queries, and just to see what sort of the potential for personalization was in each of those categories. And at least for this data set, science queries stood out as being particularly strong candidates. There was a breadth of material that typically appeared in the content, but there was also a breadth of users who wanted a specific level of material, and so that was an interesting finding. Some other ones were surprising, like I don't know why we didn't see much of a gain for health queries, because as I'll show you later, that's another very important area for reading level personalization. Anyway. Okay, so here's the, I'm not sure if this is exactly the sort of snippet, the sort of dwell time you had in mind, but this is a fascinating result. When I saw this correlation, I was kind of blown away. And what it shows is that, so in our experiments, we have snippets and we have the pages that you go to when you click on the snippet. We have reading level for both of those. The reading level for the snippets is query specific, and the reading level for the pages is query independent. And these two can be different. And so this shows what happens when they're different. So on the bottom, this shows the essentially the difference between the snippet level and the page level. So when the page is more difficult than the search engine result page snippet, that's more to the right. And when pages are easier than the snippet, those are the points to the left. The y-axis shows dwell time. And so you can see that there's a very strong correlation between the amount of time that people stay on the page, or you could also look at it as how quickly people abandon the page. So the more difference, the harder the underlying page is compared to the snippet, the more quickly people will abandon it. And one of the things this suggests is that the current snippets in the search engine aren't really sufficiently optimized. So what you would want actually is to have the expected snippet difficulty match the underlying page difficulty. We found that this is a significant effect. You saw that it was a significant feature in the ranking. We've also noted that the same kind of phenomenon holds for ODP topics. So it's a general principle of the paraphrase or the summary of the page should be as closely aligned in multiple aspects with the underlying page, and when it's not, you get these sort of undesirable abandonment effects. Okay, so I will just go over. So personalization was what I started working on. But then once we had this metadata, became clear that the obvious thing to do was to look at sites and users and add topic into the mix. So adding these ODP levels into the mix. So once you start filtering query results by reading level, you see some interesting topic drift happen. So here's the results for top 4 results for quantum theory. If you then apply reading level filter, it says, okay, I only want to see easy results for quantum theory. Well, apparently quantum theory is a PlayStation game. It's a kind of cocktail. And there's lots of sort of different interpretations of quantum theory that I didn't expect. So this is just filtering by reading level. But then so this topic drift happens a lot. I'll show you a couple of more examples. But the important thing is then you can mix back in this science topic constraints. You can add in reading level, but then sort of triangulate with the topic, and then you get some other interesting articles that really are about the scientific interpretation of quantum theory. They tend to be more colloquial articles. As you can see, people's blog articles or things sort of more high level. Cinderella is apparently a Java-based interactive geometry tool. There are also interesting literary references to Cinderella that come up. Bambi is apparently a radio telescope project. It's very interesting and not what I expected for Bambi. So anyway, the point is that modeling reading level and topic together is a very important and interesting thing and leads to much better sort of triangulation of results and profiles. So what I'm going to show you here is I'm going to use, for a given page or a given user, we're going to look at the expected reading level of this distribution, the entropy of the distribution, and then on the topic dimension we're going to look at what categories the documenter or the user prefers, the top 3, and then what the entropy of that distribution looks like. And I'll use that to classify, say, websites according to what they specialize in, what they're experts on. So if you look at the joint distribution of reading level and topic across the top level ODP categories, you get this sort of interesting distribution where you can see that the easiest category is home and shopping, recreation at the top. And as you make your way down, you see that science, reference, health, and computers are judged to be the more difficult according to reading level. If you then take websites, build a profile of topic and reading level at the website for, let's say, sample 1,000 pages from each site, you can graph, so the x-axis here is the scienciness of a website according to how strongly the ODP category predictor predicted science. And then the y-axis is the reading level. And so you can see here that there's a sort of as the scienciness of a web page increases according to the ODP classifier, there's also a general trend, upward in difficulty. On the other hand, if you look at kids pages, as the kidsness of the web page or the website, I should say, increases, there's a general downward trend in readability. So there's clearly an interaction between topic and reading level that is important to capture. So by using these reading level, the entropy measures are interesting because they measure kind of how focused a site is on a particular level or a particular topic. So you can look at the reading level entropy of a site. So what are the sites with focused reading level? So focused low, like pumpkinpatchesandmore.org, or focused high, like a lot of government or technical sites. You can look at sites with a broad range of reading level. Sites that are, I guess, trying to address a broader spectrum of users, perhaps, or topics. And so you'll see a lot of sort of about.com, sort of, in a way, meta sites that try to cover lots of different areas of different topics when you look at the entropy. So that's one dimension for reading level. Topic is also interesting, so you can look at which sites are very focused. So as I mentioned before, I think somewhere, there are sports expert sites that are very difficult for me to understand, scouting reports and the like. And so that's, prosportsdaily.com is a very focused, technical, sports-wise site. On the other hand, you have sites with very broad topical content. Typically, these are things like wisgeek.com, articles, very general, dummies.com, very general topic-oriented sites. The fun thing is you can then sort of create these sort of things like, create your snob filter. You say, I want high expected reading level, high focus, but broad topic. And so a site like WiseGeek will sort of pop up to the top in that scenario. So the point is that you can use these topic and reading level features to get at the expertness of a site. So in a previous study, Ryan White, Susan DeMay, and Jamie Teven did a very interesting and eloquent study of users, expert and non-expert users. And they also collected a set of URLs in 4 different domains. So the medical domain, computer science, legal, and finance. And when you plot the average over their collection from that paper in terms of topic entry, these are the non-expert sites in those 4 domains. And when you look at the topic entropy and reading level for the expert sites, you'll see that expert sites typically have are much more topic focused, as well as being at a generally higher level of difficulty. And so you can use these types of features to try to predict sites that are for experts and non-experts. And so there are various features you can come up with that compare the properties of those distributions, of those features of topic and reading level distributions to get something that estimates expertness. So finally, this is sort of more of an ongoing area. We published a preliminary study in our Wisdom paper a couple months ago. And that is getting at searcher motivation. So the key idea is that if you have a profile of what somebody typically likes to read and searches for, and they suddenly deviate from that profile, and suddenly they're looking at pages that are much more difficult than they would typically read, clearly they're undergoing some sort of cognitive load there. Right? There's a reason, and if they spend a lot of time on these pages, that's, you have to wonder, what is it they are interested in? How can we help them? For that particular, first of all, what are people trying to do in that scenario, and how can we help them? So examples of these types of sites that are very popular but also have very large difference from average reading level. In some ways they're not surprising. People are trying to fill out their Social Security forms. People are doing entrance exam preparation, trying to find technical, software patches, technical fixes for things. And so you can do some fun things like, so what are people searching for when they deviate from their typical reading level profile? And you can come up with, so based on the titles of things that people click, you can come up with sort of a little model of the terms or the concepts that are important, relatively speaking, compared to the background model. So the number one highest association with this sort of stretch reading behavior involved tests. And the 2 types of tests were medical tests and college entrance tests. And so you'll find that medical applications, medical searching, is a very important. This comes up in several, several of the top terms, prescriptions, medical information, and that sort of thing. Conversely, if you look at what people's what sort of negative stretch reading, people tend to read about football and sales and stores and that sort of thing. And so medical tests, government forms, financial aid, job seeking, education, computer problems, these are all areas where people exhibited a preference for the more difficult material. So just to wrap up, reading level, the intersection of reading level and the web is fascinating, and it's an area that we've just begun to explore. What are the general properties of the web when you look at it through the prism of reading level topic? So in this topic I talked about personalization, issues with snippet quality, modeling user and website expertise, searcher motivation, so getting at what is the cognitive load, what's some proxy for that. But the feature applications are also very broad. So I talked about personalization, but we could also think about adapting users to content. How can I personalize this user to the content? And what I mean is, so these are some problems you might be interested in here. What are the critical words to learn for understanding this document? So given a user and their interests and their abilities, what is the vocabulary that they need to know to understand this document at some level? What are the easier or more helpful alternatives? If there is a document that's difficult to have the user personalized to, are there better alternatives? How do we find those? There's a very interesting sort of sub-area of research right now on how to augment educational texts. First of all, identifying difficult areas of the text that are in need of augmentation, and then finding supporting links or material to help students, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, get more background or supporting evidence. In education, we have these concept dependencies. In order to learn algebra, you need to learn arithmetic. That's a simplistic example, but you can imagine how creating a customized user personalized textbook that covers concepts in a way that make more sense for that user's existing knowledge and their goals. There are a lot of ways to influence retrieval presentation. So beyond just reordering the top 10 results, there are lots of things you can imagine in customized snippets, layout of the results, and so on. There are interesting implications for site quality. So there may be interesting signals that help identify content farms where the topic of the content farm is sort of at odds with the vocabulary or the expected difficulty or the expected characteristics of those sites compared to the typical site on that topic. And finally, these kinds of models, can be retrained, and I know this is something everybody here does. Retrained for different domains and populations. So I haven't really addressed very interesting areas, specialized domains or specialized populations, non-native speakers, what it would take to personalize or to improve results for those specific populations of people. So those are all really, I think, interesting areas for future work. And that's all I have. So thank you very much. I'll take questions. So I've done some work, you mean in prediction? Or? Right, so there's been a fair amount of work in non-native reading difficulty prediction. I did some myself at Carnegie Mellon a few years ago. That's a whole nice sub-area now that focuses on that topic. So that's that type of prediction is very interesting because those people tend to already have a sophisticated view of the world. And so the difficulties tend to be more on the syntactic side.
So all the readability models you're showing us having to do with sort of words. Like it struck me that you might want to include sort of terminology or at least sort of non-compositional cases. Because red desk is obvious, but when you get into like red tape, red meat, red flag, red light district, the word red changes its meaning, and
right.
It seems like you can just easily incorporate sort of count it off and these non-compositional compound curves. So is that getting incorporated or something? And do you think it would even help?
I think it would help. It's something I would like to do. I'd love to talk with you more about efficient ways to do that. But yes, I totally agree with everything you said. I think I do think it would help. I think that is one level of granularity that would make a difference. It's interesting. Yeah, one of the challenges of implementing these traditional sort of Dale-Chaw measures that are based on list of vocabulary, if you try to automate them, there's this key step of identifying key concepts and entities that they assume a person is doing. And the reason that's important is because a lot of the texts that use unusual phrases or entities are repeating that. It's unusual and they're repeating it, but it's because they're teaching you what it means. And so it doesn't necessarily increase the difficulty of the text per se. And so identifying entities and phrases and things like that is, I think, an area that I could easily think about applying, and I would like to.
What you did mention here is the computational cost of building these models on a practical setting. That must be really limited for you.
Right. So 1 millisecond per page is a good sort of rule of thumb for the time limit we have to categorize, let's say. I would love to be able to. I would love to apply more detailed, deeper, get a richer set of features. And the main reason so far is just that there are computational constraints. But I'd love to talk with many people here about sort of how to make those kinds of trade-offs There may be techniques I'm not aware of that could get at some of the richer features in a approximate or fast way. So I'd love to learn more about that.
This RS measure that you had about difficulty, R percentage of people at some grade level are familiar with the word, and the S fraction of the words are familiar, then the document is RS familiar, and so on. This sort of raises a question in my mind about whether this ends up being a very intrinsic measure of what's in the document. And it's not really a measure of the effect reading the document has on the reader.
Right.
So I don't know if you can apply it in the web setting, so you may not even want to do this, but does someone do things like take one of these measures and give somebody who's in third grade a 8th grade reading thing and somebody else in a control group in third grade, and then give them a quiz and see if indeed the 8th grade reading goes harder? Because to me this sort of looks like a very word by word measure and aggregating bags of words, and
Right.
there's a lot more to something being readable than just the words you use.
I absolutely agree. One thing I would like to do, one of my ideal experiments would be to kind of build a language model, give each person their own reading difficulty model, and instead of having it be this sort of document-centric model, really insert in there, the language model and maybe even the evolution, over time model of a person to see where they're going. Yeah, you're absolutely right that what's missing is this is an oversimplified, estimate of what a general population might find, generally speaking, intelligible or not. And so people have done experiments in classrooms where they do the kinds of tests that you suggest. And those were to calibrate, so those people who developed these traditional sort of vocabulary-based measures did those kinds of tests in order to calibrate their lists. The interesting thing about the lists is they change over time. What words that were popular in the 1940s were typically, farm words, a lot of farm words like churn and things like that. When they updated this DLCHL list in the 1990s, they had space words and other things became more prevalent. So there's this interesting sort of dynamic need as well. So not just a static view of the vocabulary, but a need to update it over time in response to, there's as everybody knows here, there's constantly new vocabulary being introduced.
One way to sort of backtrack into that kind of analysis, if you could get the data, is to sort of start with the reading comprehension tests that are actually given in schools to first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth graders. And we know how people, and that's the part which is difficult. You could get actual performance numbers. They can be anonymized. But if you knew how kids performed in each of those tests, and then you applied this RS difficulty level to that, you could maybe tune R and S to the point where it matches actual performance, or ultimately come up with some other metric which best matches the actual performance of the kid.
Right. In these algorithms, R and S are parameters that are learned automatically from the training data. So we don't. That's where they come from. So we had three different data sets. One of them was a data set of websites that I gathered a few years ago. A few hundred websites, I think it was. Not a lot. Another one was there's a site called Reading A to Z, which provides expert calibrated web pages from grades 1 to 6 or 7, I think. And then there was a third one from the Weekly Reader. It was available from the Weekly Reader folks.
Do you think you could get a better tier books about big users?
Yeah, I think there are some really interesting things you could do to get more implicit judgments of difficulty. That we're also looking into crowdsourcing ways to. So one interesting thing is, instead of having an expert try to put a document into 1 of 12 bins, you could ask a bunch of maybe lesser experts get pairwise preferences, aggregate the pairwise preferences to get an ordering. That's another option.
So I guess agreeing with Chris, these are sort of the self-declared reading levels of these documents. Even the authors of the document say this is third grade, sixth grade. Whereas if you went with something that kids were evaluated on, you'd get the actual measured reading level.
They might be using Clutchkin K to decide that it's right.
Well, so I was going to bring that up. So a lot of these passages are biased by the fact that they use these traditional measures to calibrate them. And so I'm interested in authentic text, like things that actually occur on the web that are not, excessively tuned for, yeah.
You use this nice statistical model, but if you have enough data, I'll be really surprised with a simple machine learning kind of train on people like a by-one one, not performance by a big margin because you can do a better analysis of it. You essentially only have two parameters.
Yeah, like I said, for my purposes, the actual learning method is sort of less important than what you can do with the metadata. So, I'm not disagreeing with you. Yeah?
So I really like your idea of having a personalized model for each user of the words that they know, or maybe more abstractly the knowledge that they have. But it seems to me that once you do that, bag of words might not give you everything that you want. So just to give an example, if one of my students wants to know what Coleman filter is, and you know that they know something that can mark up models already, then having having a document that explains a Coleman filter in terms of HMM will be quite useful to them.
Right.
But that requires proximity and order. So
Right.
a document that mentions both or explains the connection the other way around won't be as useful to them.
Right. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I think the idea of having these concept dependencies, like modeling the fact that you need knowledge in this area to help you understand the next thing, or this other thing, is very interesting as well that you could exploit, I think, for that.
But I think it's a fantastic goal for being
Yeah.
able to give people explanations, particularly for technical material, explanations of things that they're prepared to understand.
Could you do this task going away with your level? Even within third grade, it's easier.
Yeah. Right.
So could you come up with a way that doesn't need these classifications?
So, yeah, that's a great question. So part of the reason that I use 12 levels is because in my initial research, I was very interested in, I'm still interested, but at the time I was especially interested in the lower levels where it makes a difference. I'm not sure it's what you're asking, but is the question more like, why would just have like low, medium, or high, or?
Or like a continuous range, because it seems like what is a third grade? Could you define a third grade reading level? Let me ask that.
Yeah, I could define a 3.2 reading level.
But I'm saying, what does it mean to read at third grade? You probably don't have a definition.
Yeah, so one thing I should mention is that the inter-rater agreement on this task is not that great. So people have typically a 1 to 2 grade difference. Even in humans, wouldn't agree for the because it is kind of an amorphous thing.
Again, because these definitions are somewhat arbitrary. If third graders just use variance and skill, right? I was trying to think if you could do the same task, like it's a great notion, but with a more just continuous range, like you could imagine a continuous metric, reading skill, without having to get into this U.S. education course.
Yeah, certainly. I think so. I think, some of the existing, like the Lexile, the nice thing about something like the Lexile score gets at, it's sort of, it tries to be a sort of a fine-grained model, not just of the text, but of the person. So, in a sense, when you're matching the person to the text, and there's not some person-independent, view of how difficult something is. It's especially interesting, a lot of these models, there is a huge difference, in the early grades where it really is important to make a distinction between 2.8 and 2.2, for example. It's not something everybody will agree on, I think. But I think that I think a continuous scale would make sense. But I think it depends on the task too. For a lot of the tasks that I talked about, you could just as easily get away with maybe a low, medium, or high categorization of difficulty. Whereas for other ones, that might not make so much sense.